Somewhere in the last hour, your own mind almost certainly deceived you about something small, a memory it quietly improved, a price it anchored to before you noticed, a face it decided to trust before you had exchanged a single word. And you never caught it in the act, because that is precisely the point. This is a list of 100 of the tricks the human brain runs on the very person carrying it. Small workarounds evolved for a world of spears and tight little tribes that now misfire constantly in a world of headlines, price tags, and strangers on a screen. Some of what follows will explain why a fair coin still feels due for tails, why a memory you would swear was accurate turns out to be partly invented, why the last 5 minutes of a difficult trip can quietly rewrite how the whole trip is remembered. None of this is a flaw to feel embarrassed about. It is machinery, built by the same evolutionary pressure that built eyesight and appetite, and it keeps running whether you approve of it or not. Settle in. There is no need to hurry through these, and nothing here is being tested. Take them one at a time in the order they arrive, and let each one sit for a moment before the next begins. Some will feel obvious once you hear them named. A few will feel like they were written about you specifically. That too is one of the tricks. A gambler is offered a fair coin flip. Heads, he wins $100. Tails, he loses $100. Most people offered this exact bet decline it, even though the arithmetic is perfectly even. That single refusal, replicated across decades of experiments, points to one of the deepest asymmetries in the human mind. The economist Kahneman and the psychologist Amos Tversky called it loss aversion, and their measurements suggested something specific. A loss of a given size hurts roughly twice as much as an identical gain feels good. Losing $20 from a wallet produces more distress than finding $20 produces delight, even though the amount in each case is the same. The mind does not weigh gains and losses on a neutral scale. It weighs losses far more heavily, which means a rational-looking decision, viewed from outside, can look completely different once loss aversion is priced in. This asymmetry explains behavior that otherwise looks strange. An investor holds onto a stock that has lost half its value for years, waiting to sell at a loss, long after the same money could be doing better elsewhere, because selling would convert a paper loss into a felt one. A homeowner overprices a house because the number they are anchored to is the number they paid, and any offer below it registers as a loss rather than simply a fair market price. A person stays in a job or a relationship that offers little, not because leaving is unwise, but because leaving requires accepting a loss now in exchange for an uncertain future gain, and the mind refuses that trade even when the future gain is larger. Evolution likely built this asymmetry for good reason. For most of human history, a lost meal or a lost season of harvest could be fatal in a way that an equivalent gain was merely helpful. A creature that feared losses more than it valued gains was a creature more likely to survive a bad season. The bias made excellent sense on the savannah. In a modern economy of stocks, subscriptions and long relationships, it often just keeps people holding on to things well past the point where letting go would serve them better. The fear of losing what you have will always weigh more than the promise of gaining something new. Ask two people with opposite political views to read the same balanced news article, and something curious happens. Both walk away more convinced than before that the article supports their own side. Neither one is lying. Neither one even notices what they are doing. This is confirmation bias, the tendency to notice, remember, and seek out information that fits what a person already believes, while quietly skating past anything that does not. It does not require dishonesty or stupidity. It operates in careful, intelligent people just as reliably as in careless ones, because it is not really a reasoning failure so much as a filtering habit built into how attention works. A believer scanning a room for evidence sees the confirming details first, the way a person looking for their own car in a parking lot sees only the cars that resemble it. The effect was documented cleanly in a 1979 Stanford study, where researchers gave supporters and opponents of capital punishment the exact same two research studies, one favoring their view and one opposing it, rather than moving toward the middle, as a purely rational reader might. Both groups became more confident in their original position. Each side had picked apart the flaws in the study that disagreed with them, while accepting the friendly study almost without question. The same evidence, filtered through belief, produced opposite conclusions. Confirmation bias explains why arguments rarely change minds, and why simply presenting facts is such an unreliable persuasion strategy. It explains why a person can read the same news for years and become more certain, never less, and why online communities built around a shared belief tend to grow more convinced of that belief over time rather than more balanced. The bias is not corrected by more information. If anything, more information gives it more material to filter through the same lens. What makes it stubborn is that it feels from the inside exactly like careful thinking. A person confirming what they already believe does not experience it as bias. They experience it as being right. The mind was never built to find the truth first. It was built to find what fits. Two groups of shoppers are shown the same bottle of wine. One group is first asked to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number before naming a price they would pay. The other is not. The group that wrote down higher digits consistently offered more money for the identical bottle. The number had nothing to do with wine. It set the anchor anyway. This is the anchoring effect, first demonstrated rigorously by Tversky and Kahneman in the 1970s, and it may be one of the most exploitable quirks in the entire catalogue of mental shortcuts. Once a number enters a person's mind, even an arbitrary one, it becomes a reference point that every subsequent judgment gets measured against, whether or not the number has any logical connection to the decision at hand. Real estate agents use this constantly. A house listed at a high asking price makes every later offer feel like a discount, even if the final sale price is well above what the house is objectively worth. Negotiators who speak first and name an aggressive number tend to land closer to that number than negotiators who wait to hear the other side's offer, because the first figure spoken becomes the anchor the entire rest of the conversation orbits. Retailers show a crossed-out higher price beside the sale price for the same reason. The crossed-out number is not really information about value. It is an anchor, planted to make the real number look small by comparison. What makes anchoring so persistent is that people who are warned about it in advance, told explicitly that the number they are about to see is meaningless, still anchor to it anyway, just slightly less than people who received no warning at all. Knowing about the trick barely dulls it. The mind treats any number in view as relevant information, a starting point to adjust from rather than noise to ignore. An adjustment away from an anchor is almost always insufficient. The first number spoken in any negotiation is rarely the fairest one. It is simply the one that gets to shape all the others. Ask a room of people whether they are more afraid of flying or driving, and a good number will say flying, despite the fact that, mile for mile, driving is statistically far more dangerous. The fear is not irrational exactly. It is simply drawing on the wrong evidence. The availability heuristic is the tendency to judge how likely or common something is by how easily examples of it come to mind, rather than by its actual frequency. A plane crash is a singular, vivid, widely covered event, replayed on every channel for days, discussed for weeks, remembered for years. A car accident, even a fatal one, rarely makes the news beyond the local paper, because car accidents happen constantly, and are therefore, paradoxically, less memorable precisely because they are so common. The mind mistakes memorability for frequency, and the result is a fear calibrated to media coverage rather than to risk. The same shortcut explains a wide range of everyday misjudgments. People who have recently seen a news story about a shark attack rate the ocean as more dangerous for weeks afterward, even though the actual number of attacks has not changed at all. People asked to estimate how many words in a passage start with the letter K tend to overestimate, because words with K in the third position are far harder to recall than words that start with K, even though the third position is actually more common. Anything that is vivid, recent, emotionally charged, or heavily reported gets an inflated seat in the mind's internal accounting of what is likely. This heuristic was almost certainly useful once. A hunter-gatherer who had recently seen a companion killed by a particular predator was wise to treat that predator as an urgent threat, regardless of its actual statistical frequency in the region. Vivid, memorable danger deserved outsized caution. What has changed is the source of the vivid memories. They no longer come from direct experience of the world around a person. They come from a screen that selects for the rare and dramatic, precisely because the rare and dramatic is what people want to watch. The mind was built to trust what it remembers easily, long before anyone thought to ask whether easy memory and real danger were the same thing. A teacher grades 2 identical exams, one attached to a photo of an attractive, well-groomed student, the other to a photo of a plainer-looking student. The exam with the attractive photo consistently receives higher marks, even though the handwriting, the answers, and every other variable are the same. Nothing about the grading process was dishonest. It simply never had a chance to be neutral. This is the halo effect, first named by the psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920, after he noticed that military officers rating their soldiers on entirely separate qualities, like intelligence, leadership, and physical bearing, produced scores that clustered together far more than they should have if the traits were truly independent. A soldier rated highly on one quality tended to be rated highly on all of them, as though one strong impression had spilled over and coloured everything else. The halo effect explains why attractive political candidates are perceived as more competent, why a well-spoken defendant is judged more sympathetically by juries even on facts unrelated to speech, and why a company that makes one excellent product is assumed, often wrongly, to make excellent products across its entire line. The mind dislikes holding a mixed, complicated impression of a person or a brand. It prefers a single coherent story, and once a strong first impression forms, everything that follows gets bent to fit that story rather than judged on its own terms. The effect works in reverse just as reliably. A single negative trait, an unkempt appearance, an awkward first handshake, a poor first sentence in an interview, can cast what researchers sometimes call a horn effect over every judgment that follows, making a person seem less competent, less trustworthy, and less likable across categories that have nothing to do with the original impression. What makes the halo effect difficult to correct is that it does not feel like bias from the inside. It feels like a series of separate, careful judgments, when in fact only the first one was ever truly independent. A good first impression is rarely earned in full. Much of it is simply lent from one trait to all the others. A couple buys tickets to a play weeks in advance. On the night of the show, a storm rolls in, the roads turn dangerous, and neither of them wants to go. They go anyway because, as one of them says, we already paid for the tickets. The money is gone either way. Going out in the storm will not bring it back, and yet the sunk cost sits there in the mind like an unpaid debt that only attendance can settle. The sunk cost fallacy is the tendency to keep investing time, money, or effort into something specifically because of what has already been invested, rather than because of what continuing is actually likely to produce. Economically, the past cost should have no bearing on the decision at all. The only question that matters is whether continuing is worth it from this point forward. But the mind treats abandonment as a kind of admission that the earlier investment was wasted, and it will often choose to waste even more, rather than accept that the first loss already happened. The pattern shows up at every scale. Governments have continued funding infrastructure and defence projects long after cost overruns, made them clearly not worth finishing, specifically because so much had already been spent that stopping felt like an admission of failure. Businesses keep struggling product lines alive for years past their sell-by date because the research and development costs were so large. Individuals finish bad meals, bad books, and bad movies rather than stopping partway, purely because they have already paid for them or already invested the time. What makes the sunk cost fallacy so persistent is that it is entangled with identity. Abandoning a project a person has poured years into does not just cost money going forward, it requires admitting, at least privately, that the years already spent were in some sense a mistake. Continuing lets a person postpone that admission a little longer, even while the cost of continuing keeps climbing. The money is already gone the moment it is spent. Only the decision about what happens next is still real. Before an election, a pundit hedges carefully, offering probabilities and caveats for either outcome. The day after, the same pundit describes the actual result as having been obvious, even inevitable, the signs having been there for anyone willing to look. Nobody accuses the pundit of lying. The pundit genuinely believes it. Hindsight bias, sometimes called the "I knew it all along" effect, describes the tendency to see past events as having been more predictable than they actually were, once the outcome is already known. The moment an outcome becomes fact, the mind quietly reorganizes memory around it, upgrading the evidence that pointed toward what happened and downgrading the evidence that pointed elsewhere, until the past feels like a story with an ending that was clear from the start. Researchers have measured this directly by asking people to record their predictions before an event, and then, afterward, asking them to recall what they had predicted. People systematically misremember their own earlier uncertainty as having been closer to the actual outcome than it really was. It is not that they lie about their past confidence. Their memory of that confidence has genuinely shifted, without their awareness, to match what later turned out to be true. The effect has serious consequences beyond casual conversation. Doctors reviewing a colleague's medical decision after a bad outcome tend to judge the original decision as more clearly wrong than doctors asked to judge the same decision without knowing the outcome, even when the information available at the time was identical in both cases. Investors look back on market crashes and describe the warning signs as obvious, forgetting how many equally loud warning signs pointed nowhere in the years before crashes that never came. Hindsight bias makes the past look tidier than it ever was while it was still happening. It is comforting in its way to believe the world makes sense in retrospect. The comfort is mostly an illusion, manufactured after the fact by a mind that cannot stand to remember how uncertain things actually felt. The past only looks obvious once it has already happened. A false claim, repeated 3 separate times across a week, is rated by listeners as more believable than the same claim heard only once, even when nothing about the evidence for it has changed at all. Repetition alone did the persuading. This is the illusory truth effect, and its mechanism is disarmingly simple. Statements that feel familiar are processed more easily by the brain, and the brain uses that ease of processing, sometimes called fluency, as a rough stand-in for truth. A sentence that slides through the mind smoothly because it has been encountered before registers as more plausible than a sentence that requires fresh effort to pass, regardless of whether the smooth sentence is actually accurate. The effect was first documented in laboratory studies in the 1970s, where subjects rated trivia statements as more true the second or third time they encountered them, simply from repeated exposure, even when the statements were flatly false. Later research extended the finding in an unsettling direction. Repetition increases perceived truth even for statements a person already knows to be false, and even when the statement is explicitly labeled false at the moment of repetition. Knowing better is not enough protection. Familiarity does its quiet work regardless. This is precisely why advertising slogans repeat, why propaganda leans on the same few phrases across every channel available, and why a rumor heard from several different sources, even if all those sources ultimately trace back to the same original claim, feels far more credible than a rumor heard once. The mind is a poor auditor of where a familiar idea actually came from. It only registers that the idea feels well worn, and worn feels safe. The defense against the illusory truth effect is not vigilance in the moment, because the effect operates below the level most people can consciously monitor. The more reliable defense is exposure to variety, actively seeking out unfamiliar sources and unfamiliar framings, so that familiarity itself stops functioning as a proxy for truth. A lie told once is a lie. A lie told often starts to feel, quietly and without anyone deciding it should, like common knowledge. A salesperson closes a large deal and describes it, without hesitation, as a result of skill, timing, and hard work. The same salesperson loses a deal the following month and describes it as the client's fault, the budget cuts, the terrible market. Both explanations came from the same honest person. Neither one was really examined. This is self-serving bias, the tendency to attribute successes to one's own ability and effort while attributing failures to factors outside one's control. It is one of the most well-replicated findings in social psychology, showing up in students explaining exam results, athletes explaining wins and losses, and executives explaining a company's rising or falling stock price. The pattern is consistent enough that researchers can often predict which direction an explanation will lean simply by knowing whether the outcome was good or bad, without knowing anything else about the situation. The bias serves an obvious emotional function. Crediting oneself for success protects and even boosts self-esteem, while blaming external factors for failure protects that same self-esteem from the alternative, more painful explanation that one simply was not good enough. In small doses, this kind of self-protection may even be healthy, cushioning a person against the corrosive effect of dwelling too long on every setback. The cost shows up over time. A person who never seriously entertains the possibility that their own choices caused a failure never learns from that failure either. Students who blame a bad grade on an unfair test rather than on their own preparation tend to prepare no differently for the next one. Executives who blame a failed product launch on market conditions rather than on flawed decisions inside the company tend to repeat those same flawed decisions in the next launch. The bias is nearly invisible from the inside because each individual explanation feels, in the moment, perfectly reasonable on its own terms. It is only visible in the pattern, in noticing that praise always seems to belong to the self, and blame always seems to belong to somewhere else. The story people tell about their own lives is rarely a lie. It is simply always, quietly, edited in their own favour. A driver cuts sharply into another lane without signalling. The driver behind them immediately assumes the offender is careless, rude, or simply a bad driver. Minutes later, that same person cuts into a lane without signalling themselves, because they suddenly realize they were about to miss their exit, and in that moment, they do not think of themselves as careless or rude at all. They think of themselves as someone reacting reasonably to an unexpected situation. This asymmetry is the fundamental attribution error, first named by the social psychologist Lee Ross, and it describes the systematic tendency to explain other people's behavior by pointing to their personality or character, while explaining one's own identical behavior by pointing to the situation. When a stranger is late, they are inconsiderate. When we are late, there was traffic. When a stranger snaps at a waiter, they are rude. When we snap at a waiter, we were having a terrible day. The reason for the asymmetry has to do with what information is available. When observing someone else, their inner situation, their stress, their deadline, their bad night's sleep is invisible. All an observer has to go on is the visible behavior itself, so the behavior gets attributed directly to the person's disposition, because that is the only explanation on offer. When judging oneself, the situational pressures are the most vivid thing present in awareness, so the explanation naturally flows toward them instead. The consequences reach well beyond road rage. Managers who judge a struggling employee as lazy, rather than considering that the employee might be dealing with an unmanageable workload or unclear instructions, tend to respond with discipline rather than support, which rarely improves performance. Juries judging a defendant's actions often underweight the situational pressures the defendant was under, because those pressures are invisible in the courtroom, while the defendant's own visible behavior fills the entire frame. Seeing someone else's situation as clearly as we see our own is not a skill most people are ever taught. It has to be deliberately practiced against a mind that finds it far easier to judge a stranger's character than to imagine a stranger's day. A student is asked to wear an embarrassing t-shirt featuring an unflattering photo of a musician most people consider cringeworthy into a room full of strangers. Before entering, the student estimates that nearly half the room will notice and remember the shirt. Afterward, when the strangers are asked directly, fewer than 1 in 4 can even recall what was on it. This gap is the spotlight effect, documented by the psychologist Thomas Gilovich and his colleagues in a series of experiments through the late 1990s. People consistently and dramatically overestimate how much others notice their appearance, their mistakes, and their awkward moments, because each person is standing at the center of their own experience and mistakenly assumes everyone else's attention is centered there too. In reality, everyone else is equally absorbed in their own spotlight, worrying about their own hair, their own last sentence, their own awkward laugh, and has very little attention left over to spend closely tracking anyone else. The spotlight effect explains a great deal of ordinary social anxiety. A person who trips slightly on a sidewalk assumes a dozen strangers noticed and judged them, when in reality most passers-by were looking at their phones, thinking about their own day, or simply not looking in that direction at all. A speaker who stumbles briefly over a word in a presentation assumes the entire audience clocked the mistake, and is now judging their competence, when audience surveys after such talks routinely show the mistake barely registered, if it registered at all. The bias is rooted in something psychologists call the curse of self-focus. Because a person's own mistakes and appearance loom so large in their own awareness, it feels intuitively obvious that they must loom just as large in everyone else's. But attention is a limited resource, and other people are spending nearly all of theirs on themselves, the same way the anxious person is spending nearly all of theirs on their own perceived flaws. Most of the audience a person fears is imaginary. The real audience is almost always looking somewhere else, absorbed in a spotlight of their own. In 1957, architects and engineers estimated that the Sydney Opera House would take 4 years to build and cost $7 million. It opened 10 years later than planned, at a final cost of over $100 million, roughly 14 times the original estimate. This was not an isolated case of incompetence. It was almost eerily the typical pattern for large public projects. The planning fallacy describes the tendency to underestimate how long a task will take or how much it will cost, even when a person has direct personal experience of similar tasks running long before. What makes the planning fallacy so stubborn is that experience alone does not seem to fix it. A person can complete 10 home renovation projects, every single one running over time and over budget, and still confidently predict that the 11th will finish on schedule. Daniel K. Newman, who studied the effect extensively, traced the problem to what he called the inside view. When estimating a task, people naturally focus on the specific plan in front of them, the steps as currently imagined, the best-case sequence of events, rather than on the historical base rate of how long similar projects have actually taken in the past. The inside view feels more relevant because it is concrete and detailed. The outside view, simply asking how long comparable projects usually take regardless of their specific plan, is a far better predictor, but it feels less connected to this particular project and gets discounted. The planning fallacy touches nearly every domain of modern life. Students underestimate how long an essay will take even after years of writing essays late. Software teams underestimate how long a feature will take to ship even after years of features shipping late. Governments underestimate infrastructure costs with such reliability that some economists half-joke the estimates should simply be tripled from the start. Kahneman's own suggested remedy, deliberately consulting the outside view, the track record of similar projects rather than the specific optimistic plan in front of you, remains one of the few debiasing techniques with reasonably strong evidence behind it, precisely because it forces the mind to stop trusting its own confident inside story. The plan always sounds reasonable in the moment it is made. It is only the finished record of every other plan like it that tells the truth. Ask newlyweds to estimate their own odds of divorce, and the average answer hovers near zero, despite the fact that roughly 4 in 10 first marriages in the country end in divorce. Ask the same newlyweds to estimate the divorce rate for couples in general, and their answers land close to the real number. The blind spot is not about marriage statistics, it is specifically about themselves. Optimism bias is the tendency to believe one's own future is likely to be better than the statistical average, even while accurately estimating that average for other people. It shows up almost everywhere researchers look for it. Smokers underestimate their own personal risk of lung disease while correctly estimating the risk for smokers in general. New business owners estimate their own odds of success far above the documented failure rate for small businesses, even when they are personally aware of that failure rate. Drivers rate themselves as safer and more skilled than the typical driver, a mathematical impossibility if taken as a description of the whole population. The bias appears to serve a genuine psychological function. Believing the future holds good things, specifically for oneself, is associated with lower stress, better immune function, and greater persistence through difficulty. A small dose of unrealistic optimism may simply be the emotional fuel that makes it possible to keep trying at all. In a world where the statistically accurate outlook on many ventures, from marriages to small businesses to creative projects, would be discouraging enough to make many people never attempt them. The cost of the bias shows up specifically in situations where realistic risk assessment actually matters for safety. A person who underestimates their own risk of a car accident may skip a seatbelt more often. A person who underestimates their own risk of a health condition may skip a preventive screening. The same optimism that fuels persistence can, in the wrong context, quietly disable the caution that would otherwise protect them. Most people expect their own future to be a pleasant exception to the very statistics they know to be true. Doctors are given a description of a surgery and asked whether they would recommend it. One group is told the surgery has a 90% survival rate. Another group is told the exact same surgery has a 10% mortality rate. These are, mathematically, identical statements. The doctors recommend the surgery far more often when it is described in terms of survival than when it is described in terms of death. This is the framing effect, one of the cleanest and most replicated findings to come out of K.H. Newman and Tversky's work on decision-making. The way information is presented, not just the information itself, shapes the decision that follows, even among trained professionals who understand percentages perfectly well, and would readily agree, if asked directly, that the two framings describe the same underlying reality. The classic demonstration involved a hypothetical disease threatening 600 people. One group was told a proposed program would save 200 people for certain. Another group was told the same program would result in 400 people dying for certain. These outcomes are identical. 200 saved out of 600 means 400 lost, yet the group presented with the saving frame overwhelmingly favoured the certain option, while the group presented with the losing frame shifted toward a riskier gamble, trying to avoid a certain loss even at greater risk. The framing effect is exploited constantly, sometimes deliberately, in menus, in medical consent forms, in political messaging. A tax described as relief is received differently than the identical policy described as a cut in services. Meat labelled 75% lean sells better than the identical meat labelled 25% fat, despite describing precisely the same product. A politician's plan framed around what will be gained tends to poll better than the identical plan framed around what will be lost, even when careful analysis shows the two framings describe an identical outcome. The underlying content of a decision rarely changes. What changes quietly and reliably is which side of the same coin gets held up to the light first. In a room of 7 volunteers, one is asked a simple question: which of 3 lines on a card matches a reference line in length? The answer is obvious. Easy enough that alone. People get it right nearly every time. But 6 of the 7 volunteers are secretly working with the experimenter, and they all confidently give the same wrong answer before the real volunteer speaks. In this setup, designed by the psychologist Solomon Asch in the 1950s, roughly 3/4 of real volunteers gave the wrong answer, matching the group at least once across a series of trials. This is conformity pressure, closely tied to what is now often called the bandwagon effect, the tendency to adopt a belief, an opinion, or a behaviour simply because other people appear to hold it, independent of any evidence for or against it. What made Asch's findings so unsettling was that the task was not ambiguous or difficult. The correct answer was obvious to anyone answering alone. The pressure came purely from disagreeing publicly with a unanimous group, and for many people, that social discomfort outweighed the discomfort of stating an answer they privately believed to be wrong. The bandwagon effect operates on a much larger scale in ordinary life. Products marketed as the fastest growing or most popular sell better, independent of quality, simply because popularity itself functions as evidence of value in the mind of a shopper who has no other easy way to judge quality. Online reviews and star ratings shift purchasing behavior sharply, and studies have found that even a single early negative review can suppress a product's sales trajectory for the rest of its life, because early signals set the tone that later shoppers interpret everything else against. Political opinions shift measurably once people learn which position is polling ahead, a phenomenon pollsters themselves worry about, since publishing a poll can shift the very outcome it measured. The pull of the crowd works even when the crowd is demonstrably wrong, and it works even on people who, when questioned afterward, insist they were not influenced at all. Most conformity happens beneath conscious awareness, felt not as pressure, but simply quiet, reasonable-seeming update to one's own opinion. Agreeing with everyone in the room is rarely a decision. It is usually just what happens before a decision gets the chance to form. Employees given the choice to switch their retirement investment fund almost never do, year after year, even when the alternative fund available to them is measurably better by every reasonable metric. Ask them why, and the most common answer is some version of it works fine as it is, despite the word fine doing a great deal of unexamined work in that sentence. This is status quo bias, the tendency to prefer whatever the current state of affairs happens to be, simply because it is current, independent of whether an available alternative would actually serve better. The bias is powerful enough that simply changing which option is the default, without changing which options are available at all, dramatically shifts what people end up choosing. Countries where organ donation is the default, requiring a person to actively opt out, have donor participation rates near 90%. Countries where organ donation requires actively opting in have participation rates often below 20%, even though both systems offer the exact same free choice. The only difference is which option requires effort to leave. Status quo bias overlaps with loss aversion. Since changing course usually means giving up something certain, the familiar arrangement, in exchange for something uncertain, the new arrangement, and losses loom larger than gains. It also draws strength from a subtler source, regret, A person who switches to a new option and has it turn out worse tends to feel more regret than a person who stayed with the old option and had it turn out just as badly, because the switch felt like an active choice while staying felt like simply letting things continue. The effect explains a great deal of ordinary inertia. People keep subscriptions they barely use because cancelling requires a decision, while continuing requires none. People stay in careers, cities, and relationships that have quietly stopped serving them well, not because leaving is unwise, but because staying is the path requiring no active choice at all. Doing nothing rarely feels like a decision. It usually just feels like the absence of one, which is exactly why it wins so often. In a laboratory study run by the psychologist Melvin Lernier in the 1960s, observers watched a woman receive electric shocks for making mistakes on a memory task. Though the shocks were staged and no one was actually hurt, observers who were told the woman would later be compensated for her suffering rated her sympathetically. Observers who were told she would receive no compensation at all, watching the identical suffering, began rating her character more harshly, describing her as somehow less likable, less careful, more deserving of what had happened to her. This is the just world hypothesis, the deep and largely unconscious belief that the world is fundamentally fair, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to people who in some way brought it on themselves. When a person witnesses suffering that cannot be easily compensated or explained away, and the belief in a fair world feels threatened, the mind often resolves the tension not by abandoning the belief in fairness, but by quietly revising its opinion of the victim instead. If the world is fair and this person is suffering, some deep assumption reasons, then perhaps this person deserved it. The consequences of this pattern reach well beyond the laboratory. Studies have found that observers exposed to descriptions of a sexual assault victim are more likely to find fault with the victim's choices, clothing, or behaviour when the victim cannot be compensated in any way, compared to when compensation or justice is available. Poverty itself is frequently blamed on the poor person's own choices or character by observers who need to preserve their belief that the world rewards effort fairly, rather than accepting how much of poverty is shaped by circumstance and luck. The just world hypothesis persists because the alternative belief that suffering is often random, unfair, and unrelated to anyone's character or deservingness is deeply unsettling. Believing the world is fair offers comfort and a sense of control. It also, quietly and reliably, produces judgment against the people who suffer within it. Blaming the victim is rarely cruelty on purpose. More often it is simply the mind protecting a comforting story about fairness at someone else's expense. The psychologist Ellen Langer ran a study in the 1970s in which office workers bought lottery tickets. Half were simply handed a ticket with a randomly assigned number. The other half were allowed to choose their own number from a set of options. Before the drawing, Langer's research assistants approached each participant and offered to buy their ticket back. Participants who had chosen their own number demanded, on average, roughly 4 times more money to give up their ticket than participants who had been handed a random one, even though every ticket had exactly the same mathematical odds of winning. This is the illusion of control, the tendency to believe a person has more influence over a purely random outcome than they actually do, simply because they performed some action connected to it, like choosing a number, rolling dice with more force, or pressing a button. The illusion appears reliably whenever an activity involves personal choice, familiar stimuli, or a sequence of small decisions, even when every one of those elements is causally disconnected from the actual random outcome. Casinos understand this instinctively, if not always academically. Dice games allow players to throw the dice themselves rather than having a dealer throw them, because players who throw their own dice bet more and stay at the table longer, feeling, however briefly, that their throw was somehow skilled rather than random. Slot machines that let a player press a button to stop spinning reels, purely cosmetic since the outcome is determined the instant the spin begins, increase playtime and satisfaction compared to machines that spin and stop automatically. The illusion of control also shows up far from casinos. Investors who actively pick individual stocks, making a series of deliberate choices, tend to feel more confident in their portfolio's prospects than investors who simply hold a broad index fund, despite decades of evidence that active picking rarely outperforms the passive alternative over the long run. The feeling of having chosen creates a feeling of having influenced, even when the underlying odds never moved at all. Choosing the number does not change the odds of the drawing. It only changes how attached a person becomes to the outcome once the choice has been made. In a series of experiments run by the psychologist Robert Zajonc in the early 1970s, subjects were shown a set of unfamiliar Chinese characters, flashed briefly on a screen, some appearing many times, others appearing only once or twice. Afterward, subjects were asked which characters they found more aesthetically pleasing, and the pattern was consistent. Characters they had seen more often were rated as more likable, even though the subjects had no idea what any of the characters meant, and could not consciously recall which ones had appeared more frequently. This is the mere exposure effect, the finding that simple repeated exposure to a stimulus increases a person's liking for it, with no other input required at all. No positive experience needs to be attached to the stimulus. No new information needs to be learned. Familiarity itself functions as a kind of reward signal in the brain, likely because, across evolutionary history, something encountered repeatedly and without harm was probably safer than something encountered for the first time, and safety over generations became quietly linked to comfort. The mere exposure effect explains a wide range of ordinary preferences that otherwise seem arbitrary. People tend to prefer the mirror image of their own face over their actual, unreversed photograph, because the mirror image is the version they see constantly in mirrors, while the unreversed photograph, seen by everyone else, is comparatively unfamiliar to them. Songs that are unremarkable on first listen frequently become favourites purely through repetition on the radio, a phenomenon the music industry has exploited for a century. Political candidates with more familiar-sounding names, independent of any policy positions, receive a measurable advantage in low-information elections, simply because the name feels comfortable in a way that translates, in the moment of voting, into a vague sense of trustworthiness. Advertisers understood this instinctively long before psychologists gave it a name, which is why brand campaigns often prioritize repetition over persuasion. A slogan does not need to convince anyone of anything. It only needs to become familiar, and familiarity will quietly do the convincing on its own. Seeing something enough times is often mistaken, deep in the mind, for actually liking it. In a study led by Daniel Newman, patients undergoing colonoscopies rated their pain at regular intervals throughout the procedure. Some procedures were shortened, ending abruptly at a moment of significant pain. Others were extended by several extra minutes, but with the added time spent at a much lower level of discomfort before the procedure ended. When asked afterward to rate how bad the overall experience had been, patients whose procedures ended gently, even though those procedures had objectively lasted longer, and therefore involved more total pain, rated the whole experience as less unpleasant than patients whose shorter procedures had ended sharply. This is the peak end rule, one of the more counterintuitive findings in the study of memory and experience. When people evaluate an experience after the fact, they do not average the moment-to-moment quality of that experience across its full duration. Instead, memory weighs 2 points far more heavily than everything else. The most intense moment, the peak, whether that peak was good or bad, and how the experience ended. The duration itself, oddly, barely factors in at all, a phenomenon Kahneman termed duration neglect. The peak end rule reshapes how vacations, meals, relationships, and even entire years get remembered. A 10-day vacation with one spectacular day and a relaxing final afternoon will often be remembered more fondly than a 14-day vacation that was pleasant throughout, but ended with a stressful, rushed departure, even though the second vacation technically offered more good days overall. A long meal that ends with a wonderful dessert is remembered as a better meal than an identical meal that ends with mediocre coffee, regardless of how good everything in between actually was. Businesses that understand this deliberately design experiences around a strong ending. Amusement parks save their most popular ride for the end of the day. Retailers ensure a pleasant, final interaction at checkout, even if earlier parts of a customer's visit were frustrating. Therapists and hospice workers, aware of the same research, pay close attention to how a difficult experience closes, knowing that the ending will shape how the whole ordeal is remembered far more than its length ever will. A long, mostly pleasant story with a bad final chapter is remembered as a bad story. Memory does not care how many good pages came before. In the 1920s, the Russian psychologist Blumarzy Garnik noticed something odd while sitting in a cafe. Waiters seemed to remember orders in extraordinary detail right up until the moment a bill was paid, and then forgot them almost immediately afterward. Curious, she designed a series of experiments giving people a set of small tasks, interrupting some before completion and allowing others to finish. Afterward, participants recalled the interrupted, unfinished tasks nearly twice as well as the completed ones. This is the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency for unfinished business to occupy far more mental space in both memory and intrusive thought than business that has already been resolved. An open task appears to create a kind of low-grade tension in the mind, a background pressure that keeps drawing attention back to it, while a completed task allows the mind to release its grip and move on to something else entirely. The effect has been put to deliberate use across entertainment and productivity alike. Television dramas end episodes on cliffhangers, precisely because an unresolved plot thread nags at the viewer's attention far more effectively than a neatly closed one, pulling them back for the next episode simply to relieve the tension of not knowing. Serialized novels and soap operas were built on the same principle for a century before television existed. A to-do list, similarly, is not primarily useful because it helps a person remember tasks. Writing a task down, researchers have found, provides a measurable amount of the same relief that actually finishing the task provides, because externalizing the unfinished item onto paper gives the mind something concrete to defer to, quieting the intrusive tension without requiring the task itself to be done. The Zeigarnik effect also explains why interrupted work can feel more mentally exhausting than work carried through to completion, even if the interrupted work required objectively less effort. An open loop keeps drawing on limited attention long after the interruption itself has ended, a quiet toll paid for every task left dangling. The mind does not rest easily around something unfinished. It keeps circling back, waiting for permission to finally let go. The economist Richard Thaler ran a simple experiment. He gave half a classroom of students a coffee mug, then asked those students the lowest price they would accept to sell it back. He asked the other half of the class, who had never received a mug, the highest price they would be willing to pay to buy one. Economic theory predicts these two numbers should be roughly the same, since it is the identical mug either way. In practice, the sellers demanded, on average, roughly twice as much as the buyers were willing to pay. This is the endowment effect, the tendency to value an object more highly for the simple reason that one already owns it, compared to the value placed on that same object before ownership begins. The moment an item becomes yours, even a moment ago, something in the mind quietly recalibrates its worth upward, and giving it up starts to feel like a loss rather than a neutral trade, drawing on the same loss aversion that makes losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. The endowment effect shows up constantly in ordinary markets. Home sellers routinely price their houses above what independent appraisers, unattached to the property, would suggest, and often above what the market ultimately bears, because the seller's sense of the house's value is inflated by the simple fact of having lived in it. Sports fans who won free tickets to a game in a lottery demand far more money to sell those tickets than fans who did not win were willing to pay for them in the first place, even though both groups value attending the games similarly before the lottery result is known. Negotiators on the selling side of any transaction consistently anchor higher than negotiators on the buying side, not out of greed exactly, but because ownership itself has already changed the felt value of the object in question. The effect helps explain why decluttering a home is so much harder than it should be in purely practical terms. An old sweater, a stack of magazines, a broken appliance kept for parts, all of it accrues a quiet excess value the moment it becomes something a person owns, a value that evaporates almost the instant the object is finally given away, at which point it often becomes hard to remember why it felt so hard to part with in the first place. Ownership does not just mark what belongs to a person, it quietly changes what that thing is worth to them. In a well-known field experiment, a grocery store set up a tasting table offering shoppers a selection of gourmet jams. On some days, the table displayed 24 different flavors. On other days, it displayed only 6. The large display attracted more people to stop and sample, drawn in by the impressive variety. But when it came time to actually buy, only about 3% of shoppers who had browsed the 24 flavor table made a purchase, compared to roughly 30% of shoppers who had browsed the 6 flavor table. This is the paradox of choice, a term popularized by the psychologist Barry Schwartz, describing the counterintuitive finding that more options past a certain point do not make people happier or more likely to choose. Instead, an overwhelming array of choices tends to produce decision paralysis, anxiety about making the wrong choice among so many possibilities, and in many cases, a retreat into choosing nothing at all rather than risk-picking incorrectly from an intimidating field of options. The effect makes intuitive sense once examined closely. Comparing 6 jams against one another is a manageable cognitive task. Comparing 24 jams, weighing each flavor profile, price, and appeal against 23 competitors, quickly becomes exhausting, and exhaustion, rather than motivating careful deliberation, tends to push people towards simply avoiding the decision entirely. The larger selection, ironically, felt more appealing to browse, precisely because it promised to satisfy more possible preferences, but that same size made the actual act of choosing considerably harder. Companies that understand the paradox of choice deliberately limit their offerings rather than maximizing them. Streaming services curate a smaller set of recommended titles rather than presenting an entire catalogue up front, because a smaller, well-chosen set of options produces more selections than an overwhelming full library. Retirement plan providers have found that offering fewer investment fund options increases enrollment rates, because employees facing dozens of unfamiliar fund choices frequently default to doing nothing at all rather than working through the comparison. More choice sounds, on its face, like it should always be an improvement. Past a certain point, it simply becomes a reason to choose nothing. Offered the choice between $50 today and $100 in a year, most people, quite reasonably, choose to wait, since doubling one's money in a single year is an excellent return. Offered the choice between $50 in 5 years and $100 in 6 years, however, a striking number of people reverse course and take the earlier, smaller amount, even though the actual waiting period between the two options, 1 additional year, is identical to the first scenario. The only thing that changed was how far away both options were from the present. This is hyperbolic discounting, the tendency to value a reward much more highly the closer it sits to the present moment, discounting the value of future rewards at a steeply declining rate rather than at the smooth, consistent rate that traditional economic models had long assumed. A reward available right now feels almost irresistibly more valuable than logic alone would justify, while 2 rewards both sitting comfortably in the future, even if separated by the same interval as the near-term choice, get compared far more rationally against each other, since neither one carries the emotional pull of immediacy. The effect explains a wide swath of everyday self-defeating behavior. A person who fully intends to save for retirement finds it far easier to commit to saving starting next year than to commit to saving starting this month, because next year's paycheck does not yet carry the immediate tangible pull of this month's paycheck sitting in the account right now. Dieters plan admirable meals for tomorrow while reaching for the dessert directly in front of them today, because tomorrow's healthy choice is abstract and distant, while today's dessert is immediate and vivid. Procrastination itself runs on the same mechanism, the discomfort of starting a task right now weighing far more heavily than the larger, more distant discomfort of finishing it under pressure later. Behavioral economists have used this insight to design useful countermeasures, like automatic retirement contributions that remove the moment of immediate choice entirely, or commitment devices that let a person lock in a future decision before the pull of the present moment has a chance to override it. The mind is a remarkably poor judge of the future when the present is standing right in front of it, offering something smaller, right now, for free. The behavioral economist Michael Norton, along with colleagues, ran a study comparing how people valued a piece of flat-pack furniture they had assembled themselves against an identical, pre-assembled version of the same item. Consistently, people were willing to pay considerably more for the version they had built with their own hands, despite it being, in every functional respect, indistinguishable from the pre-built alternative. This is the IKEA effect, named, somewhat playfully, after the Swedish furniture company whose entire business model depends on customers assembling their own products at home. The effect describes how labour, even modest, unskilled labour like tightening a few screws according to a diagram, creates a disproportionate sense of pride and attachment toward the finished object, inflating its perceived value well beyond what the object would be worth to a stranger encountering it fresh. The researchers found the effect held even for people who described the assembly process as tedious or mildly frustrating. The value did not come from enjoying the process. It came simply from having invested effort and having successfully completed something, converting a flat box of parts into a functioning piece of furniture through one's own hands. That sense of accomplishment appears to attach itself to later judged. Even by the object is later judged, even by the very person who built it. The IKEA effect explains a good deal of consumer psychology far beyond furniture. Meal kit companies that require customers to do some of their own chopping and assembly, rather than delivering a fully prepared meal, often generate stronger customer loyalty because the small labor involved creates a sense of ownership over the result. Cake mix companies discovered decades ago that removing the requirement to add a fresh egg, making the mix even easier by including powdered egg, actually reduced customer satisfaction because the mix felt too effortless to take any pride in. Adding the egg back in, requiring a small, real contribution of labor, restored the sense of having made something. A thing built by one's own hands rarely stays just an object. Some of the effort spent making it quietly becomes part of how it gets valued ever after. In a study run at Stanford, one group of participants was asked to tap out the rhythm of a well-known song, like Happy Birthday, using only their knuckles on a table, while a second participant listened and tried to guess the song. Tappers predicted that listeners would guess correctly around 50% of the time. In reality, listeners guessed correctly only about 2.5% of the time. The tappers, hearing the full melody complete with lyrics playing vividly in their own heads as they tapped, could not imagine how sparse and meaningless the same rhythm sounded to someone without that melody already in mind. This is the curse of knowledge, the difficulty a person has in imagining what it is like not to know something they themselves already know. Once information is acquired, it becomes almost impossible to fully simulate the mental state of a person who lacks it, and this makes experts, teachers, and anyone deeply familiar with a subject systematically poor judges of how confusing their own explanations sound to a genuine beginner. The curse of knowledge helps explain why experts often make frustrating teachers despite knowing their subject far better than anyone else in the room. A physicist, explaining a concept effortlessly to a colleague, may skip steps that feel too obvious to mention without realizing those very steps are precisely where a beginner gets lost. A software engineer writing documentation for a product they built assumes context that took them months to acquire, leaving new users baffled by instructions the engineer genuinely believed were clear. The effect also shapes negotiations and communication more broadly. A person delivering bad news, already having processed the situation and its implications over hours or days, often underestimates how shocking or confusing the news will land on someone hearing it for the first time in a single sentence. Writers revising their own work struggle to spot places where a reader, lacking the writer's full mental picture of the story, would become confused, because the writer's own head is already so thoroughly filled with everything the reader has not yet been told. Once a person knows something, imagining not knowing it becomes, quietly and permanently, one of the hardest mental tasks there is. In a 1977 study, researchers asked college students whether they would be willing to walk around campus wearing a large sandwich board sign, carrying an advertising slogan. Students who agreed to wear the sign estimated that most other students, roughly 2/3, would also agree to wear it. Students who refused estimated that most other students, again roughly 2/3, would also refuse. Each group, in other words, assumed their own personal choice reflected the general consensus, when the actual population was split almost evenly. This is the false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate how widely one's own opinions, habits, and choices are shared by other people. A person who holds a particular political view tends to assume that view is more common among the general population than it actually is. A person with an unusual habit or preference tends to assume it is more typical than survey data would ever support. The effect appears to arise partly because people surround themselves, often without fully realizing it, with others who share their views, creating a social environment that quietly confirms and inflates the sense that their own position is the normal, majority one. The false consensus effect has significant consequences in political and social life. People on opposite sides of contentious issues each tend to believe their own side represents the silent majority, which can make political compromise feel unnecessary from either direction. since each side assumes the broader public already agrees with them, and the disagreement is simply confined to a vocal, unrepresentative minority on the other side. Online, the effect is amplified by algorithmically curated feeds that show people more of what they already engage with, creating small, self-reinforcing bubbles that feel, from the inside, exactly like the wider world. The effect also shapes everyday assumptions about normalcy. A person who grew up in a household with a particular habit, a particular way of arguing, a particular relationship with money, often assumes that habit is the ordinary baseline everyone else operates from too, and can be genuinely startled to discover how differently other households actually function. The world inside a person's own head rarely feels like one opinion among many. It feels, quietly and persistently, like the obvious majority. A commuter running late for a meeting weaves aggressively through slower traffic and explains, if asked, that they were simply reacting to being late, a situational pressure anyone would understand. Minutes later, that same commuter is cut off by another driver weaving through traffic, and their immediate reaction is not sympathy for whatever situation the other driver might be facing, but irritation at what they assume is simply a reckless, inconsiderate person. This pattern, closely related to the fundamental attribution error, but focused specifically on the gap between judging oneself and judging others, is known as the actor-observer asymmetry. When a person is the actor in a situation, the actual doer of the behavior, their own attention is naturally drawn toward the surrounding circumstances that prompted the action, because those circumstances are the most vivid thing available in their own awareness. When the same person becomes an observer of someone else's identical behavior, the circumstances behind that other person's action are invisible, so attention settles instead on the behavior itself, and from there, onto assumptions about that person's character. Researchers have found this asymmetry holds up across an enormous range of behaviors, from minor traffic incidents to workplace conflicts to relationship arguments. In a disagreement between partners, each person tends to explain their own harsh words as an understandable reaction to stress or provocation, while explaining the other partner's harsh words as evidence of a controlling or unreasonable personality. Neither partner is being dishonest. Each is simply working from a different vantage point, one from the inside of their own circumstances, and one from the outside of the other person's, where those circumstances cannot be seen at all. The asymmetry tends to soften. Interestingly, the better two people come to know each other, since long familiarity gives an observer more access to the other person's circumstances, closer to the access they have to their own. Strangers judge each other almost entirely by visible behavior. Close friends and long-term partners, at their best, learn to extend the same situational generosity to each other that they automatically extend to themselves. Seeing another person's circumstances as clearly as we see our own does not happen naturally. It only happens once someone has taken the trouble to actually look. Shoppers sent to a grocery store while hungry consistently buy more items, and more impulsive items, than shoppers who go while full, are finding replicated often enough that it has become standard financial advice never to shop for groceries hungry. What is less obvious is a second finding from the same body of research. Hungry shoppers also predict, incorrectly, that their future hungry self several days from now will want to buy exactly the amount of food they are buying right now, while full shoppers underestimate how much food they will actually want later in the week. This is projection bias, sometimes described through the related idea of a hot-cold empathy gap, the tendency to assume that one's own current emotional or physical state will persist, and to project that current state onto future decisions or onto other people's decisions, even when the state itself is temporary. A person in a hot state, meaning an intense emotional or physiological condition like hunger, anger, arousal, or pain, has enormous difficulty accurately imagining how they will feel or what they will want once that hot state has passed, and they return to a calmer, cold state. The effect explains behavior far beyond grocery shopping. A person making a decision while furious often cannot accurately predict how differently they will feel about the same decision once calm, which is part of why so much conventional wisdom advises waiting before sending an angry message or making an irreversible choice during a heated argument. Patients asked, while in significant pain, to predict how much pain medication they will want during recovery consistently overestimate their future need, because the immediate hot state of pain colors their forecast of a future cold state that has not arrived yet. Projection bias also distorts how people judge others. A person who is currently calm and well-fed has genuine difficulty empathizing with a friend's hunger-driven irritability or a colleague's anger-driven outburst because their own cold state makes the other person's hot state feel exaggerated or unreasonable, simply because they cannot access, even in imagination, how differently the world looks from inside that intensity. The self a person is right now rarely predicts the self they will be an hour from now nearly as well as either of them assumes. In 1961, the economist Daniel Ellsberg presented people with two urns. The first urn contained 50 red balls and 50 black balls, a known fixed ratio. The second urn contained 100 balls total, red and black, in an unknown ratio that could be anything from all red to all black. Asked to bet on drawing a red ball, most people chose to bet on the known urn, even when told explicitly that the unknown urn's odds, averaged across every possible ratio, were mathematically identical. This pattern, now called ambiguity aversion or the Ellsberg paradox, describes a preference for known risks over unknown ones. Even when the known and unknown options carry the exact same expected value, it is subtly different from ordinary risk aversion, which is simply a preference for safer bets over gambles. Ambiguity aversion specifically targets uncertainty about the odds themselves, a discomfort not with risk but with not knowing the risk, which turns out to be its own distinct and powerful force in decision-making. The effect shows up in financial markets, where investors will often pay a premium to invest in assets with well-understood, well-documented risk profiles over assets with unclear or opaque risk profiles, even when analysts estimate the underlying expected returns to be similar. It shows up in medical decision-making, where patients frequently prefer a treatment with a clearly stated, even if unfavorable, success rate over an experimental treatment whose success rate has simply not yet been well established, sometimes even when the experimental option carries a higher expected chance of a good outcome. It shows up in everyday choices as small as preferring a restaurant with a familiar menu over a new restaurant with no reviews yet, even when the new restaurant might on average be just as good or better. Ambiguity aversion suggests that uncertainty itself, independent of danger, carries its own psychological cost. It is not simply that people fear bad outcomes. It is that not knowing the odds at all feels like its own kind of threat, one the mind will pay to avoid even when avoiding it makes no mathematical sense. Given the choice between a known bad and an unknown maybe, most people, quietly and consistently, choose the bad they can at least measure. During a sharp stock market downturn, researchers studying online brokerage accounts found something unexpected. The number of investors logging in to check their portfolio balances dropped noticeably, precisely during the period when their money was losing the most value. Logically, a falling portfolio would seem to demand more attention, not less. The behavior ran in exactly the opposite direction. This is the ostrich effect, the tendency to avoid information specifically when that information is likely to be unwelcome, even when the information would be useful, even when checking costs almost nothing, and even when avoiding it does absolutely nothing to change the underlying reality being avoided. The name draws on the old, factually inaccurate image of an ostrich burying its head in sand to escape danger, and while ostriches do not actually do this, people, it turns out, very much do. The ostrich effect explains a wide range of everyday avoidance. People with unresolved medical symptoms delay scheduling a doctor's appointment, sometimes for months, not because they do not care about their health, but because not knowing, however briefly, feels more bearable than confirming a fear. People carrying credit card debt often avoid opening the monthly statement entirely, letting envelopes pile up unopened, because the certainty of a bad number feels worse in the moment than the fog of simply not looking. Students who suspect they performed poorly on an exam frequently delay checking the posted grade for as long as the system allows, extracting a strange comfort from the ambiguity itself, even while knowing the grade is already fixed and unaffected by when they choose to look. What makes the ostrich effect particularly costly is that, unlike some biases that merely distort perception, this one actively prevents the very information a person would need to correct course. A medical symptom left unchecked can worsen. A debt left unopened can accrue further interest. The avoidance does not pause the problem, it only pauses the person's awareness of it, while the problem itself quietly and indifferently continues. Not looking has never once changed what is actually there, it only changes for a little while who has to know it. Researchers studying bettors at a horse racetrack found something odd. Bettors rated their chosen horse's chances of winning noticeably higher after placing their bet than they had rated that same horse just moments before placing it. Nothing about the horse, the track, or the odds had changed in that brief window. Only one thing had changed: the bet had been placed. This is choice-supportive bias, sometimes called post-decision rationalization, the tendency to retroactively inflate one's opinion of whichever option was chosen, specifically once the choice has already been made and can no longer be easily reversed. Before a decision, a person may weigh several options with genuine, even balanced, uncertainty. The instant a choice is locked in, that balance shifts, often within seconds, toward favoring the chosen option, while the qualities of the rejected alternatives, whether a different horse, a different job offer, or a different car, quietly diminish in the mind's retrospective accounting. The effect appears to be driven by a discomfort psychologists call cognitive dissonance, an uneasy tension that arises whenever a person holds two conflicting beliefs at once, in this case, having chosen something while still privately entertaining doubts about whether that something was actually the best option. Rather than sit with that tension, the mind resolves it by quietly adjusting the belief that is easiest to change, which is usually the evaluation of the choice itself, upward, and the evaluation of the alternatives, downward. The effect shows up constantly in consumer behavior. A person who buys a car reports, weeks later, being more satisfied with that model than they had rated it as a prospective buyer before the purchase, even without any new information about the car's actual performance. Voters who cast a ballot for a candidate report increased confidence in that candidate's abilities almost immediately after leaving the polling booth, compared to their confidence just before voting, despite no new facts about the candidate having emerged in the intervening minutes. Once a decision cannot easily be undone, the mind stops weighing the choice honestly, and starts quietly defending it instead, converting uncertainty after the fact into a confidence that was never really earned. In the 1950s, grocery stores testing a new laundry detergent found that a batch of the product accidentally lost its usual blue coloring dye during manufacturing, turning the detergent an unappealing grey. Rather than discard the batch, the manufacturer quietly sold it alongside the normal blue version, with a small, almost apologetic notice warning that this batch had turned out different in appearance. Sales of the grey detergent, against all expectation, outpaced the normal blue version. Curious shoppers, drawn by the very fact that something about the product had been flagged as unusual, bought it specifically to see what the fuss was about. This pattern belongs to a broader phenomenon called psychological reactance, first formally described by the psychologist Jack Brem in 1966. Reactance describes the surge of motivation a person feels to do, believe, or acquire something specifically when they perceive their freedom to choose it is being restricted or discouraged. A warning label, a restriction, or an explicit prohibition does not simply block a desire. Very often, it manufactures one or intensifies an existing one, purely by making the restricted option feel scarce or forbidden. Reactance explains a great deal of behavior that otherwise looks paradoxical. Teenagers told firmly not to date a particular person or pursue a particular path frequently become more drawn to exactly that person or path, a pattern well documented enough that it has its own folk name, the Romeo and Juliet effect. Products marketed with limited availability or restricted access, banned in some regions, available only to a select few, sell better specifically, because the restriction signals scarcity and provokes the reactance response. Reverse psychology, a technique long used informally by parents, negotiators and salespeople, works by deliberately triggering this exact mechanism, suggesting a person should not or cannot have something in order to increase, rather than decrease, their desire for it. The deeper root of reactance appears to be a fundamental resistance to any perceived loss of autonomy. People do not simply want things. They want the freedom to choose things, and any signal that this freedom is under threat activates a defensive pushback, often stronger than the original desire for the restricted thing ever was on its own. Forbidding something rarely makes it disappear from a person's wanting. Quite often, it is the surest way to plant that wanting in the first place. In a demonstration the psychologist Robert Cialdini has described often, a single person stands on a busy city sidewalk, tilts their head back, and stares up at the sky for a minute, and almost nobody else stops to look. Add a few more people staring upward alongside the first, and passers-by begin slowing down, glancing up briefly out of curiosity. With a larger group, a genuine crowd, staring intently at nothing at all, a striking number of strangers stop entirely and join in, craning their necks upward at an empty sky, simply because everyone else appeared to be looking at something worth seeing. This is social proof, the tendency to look to the behavior of others, especially a group of others, as a shortcut for figuring out how to behave or what to believe, particularly in situations where a person is uncertain what the correct response should be. Social proof operates on a simple, largely unconscious logic. If many other people are doing something, there is probably a good reason for it, even if that reason is not immediately visible. The principle is deployed constantly and deliberately across marketing and persuasion. Online reviews and testimonials work not primarily by conveying detailed information about a product's quality, but by signaling that other people have already tried it and approved, which shortcuts the harder work of independent evaluation. Studio audience laugh tracks on television comedies, still used today despite widespread awareness of the technique, measurably increase how funny viewers rate a given joke, purely because hearing others laugh functions as social proof that the joke is, in fact, funny. Charities that post the amount already donated by other contributors before asking for a new donation raise more money than charities that ask cold, because the visible participation of others functions as evidence that the cause is worth supporting. Social proof is strongest precisely in moments of uncertainty, which is exactly why it operates so powerfully in unfamiliar restaurants, unfamiliar cities, and unfamiliar decisions of every kind, where a person has the least independent information to go on and the most reason to lean on the visible behavior of everyone else around them. A crowd staring at nothing will draw a bigger crowd every time, not because anyone actually sees something, but because everyone assumes somebody else already has. A restaurant adds a single dish to its menu priced dramatically higher than everything else on the page, a lobster platter costing several times more than the next most expensive entree. Curiously, that expensive dish rarely sells much at all. What does change is that sales of the second most expensive dish on the menu rise noticeably, because that formerly pricey item, sitting right beside the new extreme, suddenly looks like the reasonable moderate choice by comparison. This is the contrast effect, the finding that the perceived value, size, or quality of an object is judged not in isolation but relative to whatever else happens to be presented alongside it. A price that would seem high on its own can seem entirely reasonable, even attractive, once placed beside a higher price, and a price that would seem reasonable on its own can seem expensive once placed beside a much lower one. The absolute number rarely matters as much as the number sitting beside it. Retailers and negotiators use the contrast effect deliberately and constantly. Real estate agents sometimes show a client a deliberately unappealing, overpriced house before showing the house they actually intend to sell, so that the second, genuinely reasonable option feels like an obvious bargain by comparison. Subscription pricing pages frequently present three tiers: a cheap basic option, an expensive premium option, and a middle option, where the middle option is often the one the company most wants sold, made to look like sensible value purely by sitting between two contrasting extremes. Salary negotiations shift measurably, depending on what number was mentioned just before the real offer, since even an unrelated high number mentioned moments earlier can make the actual offer feel comparatively modest. The contrast effect works because human perception, across nearly every domain from temperature to brightness to price, is fundamentally built to notice differences in relationships rather than absolute values. A room feels warm walking in from the cold and feels cool walking in from a heated car, despite being exactly the same temperature in both cases. A price behaves the same way, feeling expensive or cheap not on its own terms, but entirely in relation to whatever price happened to be shown right before it. No price is ever really judged on its own. It is always judged against whatever was standing next to it a moment earlier. Ask someone to memorize a list of 20 unrelated words read aloud one after another, then ask them, without warning, to recall as many as they can. The results form a remarkably consistent shape across nearly every person tested. The first few words on the list and the last few words are recalled reliably well, while the words sitting in the middle of the list are recalled far less often, sometimes barely at all. This is the serial position effect, made up of two separate but related phenomena. The primacy effect describes the advantage enjoyed by items presented early in a sequence, likely because those early items have more time to be rehearsed and transferred into longer-term memory before the rest of the list interferes. The recency effect describes the advantage enjoyed by items presented last, likely because those items are still sitting fresh in short-term memory at the exact moment of recall before anything else has had a chance to displace them. Everything in the middle receives neither advantage, arriving too late to be well rehearsed and too early to remain fresh, and it simply gets crowded out from both directions. The serial position effect shapes far more than memory experiments. In job interviews, candidates seen first and candidates seen last in a long day of interviews tend to be remembered and rated more favourably than candidates seen in the middle of the schedule, a pattern strong enough that career advisors routinely recommend trying to secure either the first or the final interview slot when possible. In court cases and debates, the order in which arguments are presented has been shown to shift juror and audience judgment independent of the actual strength of the arguments themselves. Résumés, presentations, and speeches are frequently structured with the strongest material placed first and last, precisely because that is where an audience's memory is most reliably going to hold on. The middle of almost anything, a list, a meeting, a long day of appointments, occupies a kind of memory blind spot, present and experienced in the moment, but strangely resistant to being recalled clearly afterward. What gets remembered from any sequence is rarely what mattered most. Very often, it is simply whatever happened to arrive first or last. In 1948, the psychologist Bertram Forer gave his students a personality test, then handed each student a supposedly personalized written analysis of their results, asking them to rate, on a scale of 0 to 5, how accurately the description matched their own personality. The average rating came back at 4.2 out of 5, remarkably high. What none of the students knew was that every single one of them had received the exact same generic description, assembled from vague statements found in a newspaper horoscope column. This is the Barnum effect, named after the showman P.T. Barnum, celebrated for his ability to please a very wide and varied audience with the same broad appeal. The effect describes how a vague, generalized personality description, one filled with statements that could plausibly apply to almost anyone, feels remarkably specific and personally accurate to the individual reading it, because the reader unconsciously fills in the vague language with details from their own particular life, making a generic statement feel tailor-made. A typical Barnum statement might describe someone as having a strong need for other people to like and admire them, while also being their own harshest critic in private. Nearly everyone, reading such a statement, can locate a moment in their own life where it felt true, because the statement is broad enough to have an almost universal application. The specificity that makes it feel personal is supplied entirely by the reader, not by the description itself. The Barnum effect underlies the enduring appeal of horoscopes, generic personality quizzes, and some forms of fortune-telling, all of which rely on statements vague enough to apply broadly while feeling, to each individual reader, uncannily precise. It also explains why cold reading, a technique some psychics and mentalists use, can seem so convincing to a client, since a handful of broad, emotionally resonant guesses will nearly always land close enough to something true in a stranger's life to feel like genuine insight. An accurate feeling description and an accurate description are not always the same thing. Sometimes the accuracy was never in the words at all. It was supplied quietly by the reader. In a widely cited survey of American drivers, participants were asked to rate their own driving skill compared to other drivers on the road. Roughly 9 out of 10 respondents rated themselves as above average, a result that is mathematically impossible for the group as a whole, since by definition only half of any population can actually be above the median. This is illusory superiority, sometimes called the better-than-average effect, the widespread tendency for people to rate their own abilities, from driving to intelligence to fairness to a sense of humour, as better than the typical person, even in domains where a large majority of the population cannot possibly all be correct at once. The effect has been replicated across dozens of countries and dozens of different skills and traits, making it one of the most consistently document biases in the society. The pattern appears strongest specifically in tasks that feel easy or subjective. People asked to rate their driving, their sense of humour, or their honesty tend to show the strongest illusory superiority, because these are domains where clear, objective feedback is rare, leaving plenty of room for a flattering self-story to go unchallenged. In domains with frequent, unambiguous feedback, like competitive sports with clear scores or academic tests with clear grades, the effect shrinks considerably because reality intervenes often enough to correct an inflated self-image. Illusory superiority appears to serve a self-esteem protecting function similar to self-serving bias, offering a comforting, motivating sense that one is doing reasonably well relative to everyone else, even when the objective evidence for that belief is thin or entirely absent. The cost shows up in situations where accurate self-assessment genuinely matters. Overconfident drivers take more risks. Overconfident investors trade more often, typically at a net loss compared to investors with more modest and accurate views of their own skill. Overconfident managers resist feedback that might have improved their decisions because the feedback conflicts with an already inflated internal picture. Nearly everyone believes, quietly and sincerely, that they are somewhat better than most people at most things. Mathematically, most of them have to be wrong, and none of them ever feel like the one who is. Researchers presented a group of people who held a strong, factually incorrect political belief with a carefully sourced factual correction, directly addressing and refuting that belief. A portion of the group, rather than updating their view toward the correct facts, reported even stronger confidence in the original incorrect belief after seeing the correction than they had held before seeing it. This pattern, known as the backfire effect, describes situations in which correcting a false belief with clear factual evidence produces the opposite of the intended result, entrenching the belief more deeply rather than dislodging it. The effect is not universal, and researchers continue to debate exactly how often and under what conditions it actually occurs. But it has been documented clearly enough in specific studies, particularly around politically or emotionally charged beliefs, to be taken seriously as a real if inconsistent phenomenon. One proposed explanation ties the backfire effect to identity protective reasoning. When a belief is closely tied to a person's sense of group identity or self-image, a factual correction to that belief can feel less like new information and more like a personal attack on the identity the belief supports. Rather than simply updating the belief, the mind can respond to that perceived threat by doubling down, generating counter-arguments, and searching for reasons to dismiss the correction, a defensive process that can leave the original belief feeling even more secure than before the correction arrived, purely because it has now survived a challenge. The backfire effect has significant implications for anyone trying to correct misinformation, whether in journalism, public health, or ordinary conversation. Simply presenting the correct facts, however well sourced, is not guaranteed to work, and in emotionally charged or identity-linked cases may occasionally make things worse. Researchers studying effective correction strategies have found that approaches which affirm a person's underlying values or identity first, before introducing the correcting facts, tend to produce better results than approaches that lead with the correction alone, since the correction is less likely to feel like a threat if the person's broader sense of self has not been challenged in the same breath. Facts alone have never been quite as persuasive as people like to assume. Sometimes, offered without care for what a belief is protecting, they only strengthen the wall they were meant to bring down. A company spends years and a substantial budget developing a new product, only to discover partway through that market conditions have shifted and the product is unlikely to succeed. Rather than stopping the project and accepting the loss already incurred, the leadership approves additional funding to finish it anyway, reasoning that too much has already been invested to abandon it now. The finished product, released after further delay and further cost, performs exactly as poorly as the early warning signs suggested it would. This is escalation of commitment, a close cousin of the sunk cost fallacy, but operating specifically in organizational and group decision-making, where continued investment in a failing course of action tends to increase, rather than decrease, the longer that course of action continues to fail. What distinguishes escalation of commitment from an individual's sunk cost error is the added layer of public accountability. In an organization, the person who championed the original decision often has their own reputation and credibility tied to the project's success, and abandoning the project can feel, to that person, like publicly admitting a personal failure, which creates additional pressure to keep going, past the point where the underlying facts alone would justify continuing. Business historians point to a wide range of real examples. Large infrastructure projects continued for years past the point of clear financial sense. Product lines kept alive through repeated relaunches despite years of poor sales. Mergers pursued to completion despite mounting evidence during due diligence that the deal made little strategic sense. In each case, the pattern is similar. Early warning signs appear, get acknowledged, and get overridden anyway, because stopping would require someone, often someone senior and visible, to admit that the original decision was a mistake. Organizations that manage to avoid escalation of commitment most successfully tend to build in specific structural safeguards, such as assigning a decision's ongoing review to someone who was not involved in making the original call, precisely because a person without personal or reputational stake in the project's origin is far more willing to recommend stopping it when the evidence calls for it. The deeper an organization gets into a failing decision, the harder it becomes for anyone inside it to be the one who finally says stop. A subscription software company offers two pricing tiers, a basic plan at $10 a month and a premium plan at $25 a month with considerably more features. Sales are modest and roughly split between the two. The company then introduces a third tier priced at $23 a month, offering only slightly more than the basic plan but noticeably less than the premium plan, a tier that, on paper, looks like a poor value compared to either existing option. Almost nobody signs up for this new middle tier, but sales of the premium plan rise sharply, because the new clearly inferior option makes the premium plan, sitting just $2 above it with far more features, suddenly look like an obvious bargain by comparison. This is the decoy effect, sometimes called asymmetric dominance, a pricing and choice architecture technique in which an option is deliberately introduced into a set of choices, not because anyone is meant to choose it, but purely to shift preference toward one of the other existing options by comparison. The decoy itself is almost always chosen by very few people. Its job is not to be selected. Its job is to make a specific other option look better than it would look on its own. The technique has been studied extensively in behavioral economics, most famously through experiments involving magazine subscriptions, where adding a clearly inferior print-only option alongside an existing web-only option and a combined web and print option shifted a large share of buyers toward the combined option, which had appeared far less popular before the decoy was introduced. The mere presence of a bad option, even one virtually nobody chooses, changes how good the surrounding options look, because comparison, not absolute evaluation, is how the mind actually judges value. Minus, subscription pages, and retail displays use the decoy effect constantly, often without customers ever noticing that one of the available choices exists purely as a comparison tool rather than a genuine option meant to be selected. Some choices on a menu were never really meant to be chosen at all. They were placed there simply to make a different choice look better standing next to them. In the summer of 2001, a series of shark attacks off the coast of Florida received extensive, sustained media coverage, prompting widespread public fear and a noticeable drop in beach tourism along parts of the eastern coastline. Actual shark attack statistics for that year showed no meaningful increase compared to previous years. What had changed was not the underlying danger. What had changed was how much attention that danger was receiving. This is an availability cascade, a term coined by the legal scholars Timur Kuran and Cass Sunstein to describe how a rare event, once it captures sustained media attention, can trigger a self-reinforcing cycle of public concern that grows disproportionate to the event's actual statistical frequency. The mechanism builds directly on the availability heuristic, the tendency to judge risk by how easily examples come to mind, but adds a social amplification layer. Once a story gains enough visibility, more outlets cover it, more people discuss it, and that increased visibility itself becomes evidence, in the public's mind, that the danger must be significant, which drives still more coverage, in a loop that can run for weeks with very little relationship to the actual underlying statistics. Availability cascades have shaped public reaction to a wide range of rare but vivid dangers, from specific crime patterns to particular product safety, scares to unusual disease outbreaks. In many documented cases, the initial event triggering the cascade was genuinely rare, sometimes rarer than a dozen more mundane and far more statistically significant dangers that receive comparatively little coverage because they lack the same vivid, story-ready quality. The cascade tends to end the same way it begins, not through any change in the underlying statistics, but through a gradual loss of media and public interest, as the story eventually gives way to newer, more urgent-seeming stories, and the public's sense of danger recedes just as disproportionately as it once rose. A single dramatic story can convince an entire population that danger is everywhere, while the actual numbers, unchanged and largely unnoticed, sit quietly in the background the whole time. In a classic visual search experiment, participants were shown grids of faces and asked to find the single angry face hidden among a crowd of neutral or happy faces, or alternatively, to find the single happy face hidden among a crowd of neutral or angry faces. Across repeated trials, participants located the angry face faster and more reliably than they located the happy face, and the effect held even as researchers scaled up the size of the crowd, suggesting the angry face was somehow easier for attention to latch onto in the first place. This is attentional bias toward threat, a finding rooted in what researchers sometimes describe more broadly as the mind's negativity bias in perception, the tendency for attention systems to prioritize and process potentially dangerous or threatening stimuli faster and more thoroughly than neutral or positive stimuli. The advantage makes clear evolutionary sense. An ancestor who was slow to notice a genuinely happy expression lost very little. An ancestor who was slow to notice a genuinely hostile one, in an environment with real predators and real interpersonal violence, could pay for that slowness with their life. Across enough generations, the attention system that scanned fastest for threat was the attention system most likely to survive and be passed on. The bias operates below conscious control and shows up even in newborns and infants too young to have learned social fear through experience, suggesting the wiring is present from very early in development rather than something acquired purely through a person's own bad experiences. In modern life, this ancient threat-scanning circuitry has very little use for its original purpose, since most people encounter few genuine physical threats in an ordinary day, but the circuitry itself has not been updated to reflect that change. The consequence is a mind constantly primed to notice, dwell on, and remember alarming information far more readily than reassuring information, a tendency that news media, whether deliberately or simply by following what draws attention, exploits constantly, filling feeds and broadcasts with threat-framed stories precisely because threat-framed stories are what the ancient scanning circuitry cannot help but notice first. The eye finds the angry face in a crowd before it finds anything else, a habit built for a world of real danger, still running quietly in a world that mostly no longer needs it. Researchers studying married couples asked each partner separately to estimate what percentage of the household's shared chores, from cooking to cleaning to childcare, they personally performed. When the two partners' answers were added together, the combined total routinely exceeded 100%, sometimes reaching well past 130%. A mathematical impossibility if either partner's estimate had been fully accurate. This is egocentric bias, the tendency to overestimate one's own contribution to a shared task or a shared outcome, not out of dishonesty, but because a person's own effort is simply far more visible and memorable to them than the effort of anyone else involved. Every time a person cooks a meal, they experience it directly, from the planning to the shopping to the standing at the stove. When their partner cooks a meal, that same person experiences only the outcome, arriving at a set table without having witnessed the planning or preparation firsthand, which makes that contribution far less vivid and far less memorable in comparison. The same pattern appears in workplace teams, where members asked to estimate their own share of credit for a group project success routinely produce a combined total well above 100% when all team members' self-estimates are added together. It appears in academic co-authorship, where each contributing author, asked privately, often believes they did the larger share of the intellectual work. It appears even in something as small as remembering who last took out the trash, where each partner in a household can sincerely recall and defend a different answer to the exact same question, each one convinced their own memory is the accurate one. Egocentric bias is not really about ego in the sense of vanity. It is a straightforward consequence of how memory works, weighted heavily toward what a person has personally experienced, and comparatively light on what they have only witnessed secondhand. The distortion happens automatically, without any intention to take undue credit, which is part of why it causes so much genuine, sincere disagreement between people who are each, from their own vantage point, telling the truth. Everyone remembers their own effort in vivid detail, and everyone else's effort only in outline, which is exactly why the math of shared work almost never quite adds up. A manager delivers a performance review consisting of 9 specific pieces of praise and 1 piece of criticism. Ask the employee afterward what they remember most vividly about the conversation, and it is, with striking reliability, the single criticism, replayed for days, while the 9 compliments fade within the hour. This is negativity bias, one of the broadest and most deeply rooted patterns covered in this list, and in many ways the quiet engine underneath several of the tricks already described. Negative events, negative information, and negative feedback are processed more thoroughly, remembered more vividly, and weighted more heavily in decision-making than positive events of equivalent size. Researchers reviewing decades of psychological literature have found this asymmetry across an enormous range of domains. Negative first impressions are harder to reverse than positive ones. A single instance of betrayal weighs more heavily on trust than many instances of loyalty, and news coverage skewed toward disaster and threat reliably draws more attention and more engagement than coverage of steady, ordinary good news, regardless of what audiences claim to prefer when asked directly. The evolutionary logic runs through nearly everything covered across this entire list. A missed opportunity for a reward was rarely fatal for an ancestor navigating the natural world. A missed sign of danger very often was. Across enough generations, minds that weighted threat and loss more heavily than opportunity and gain were the minds that survived long enough to pass that same weighting forward, and the weighting has remained largely unchanged since, even as the actual dangers of daily life have shifted dramatically. What makes negativity bias worth closing on is how visibly it touches every other trick already covered in this list. Loss aversion, the very first item, is negativity bias applied specifically to money. Attentional bias toward threat is negativity bias applied specifically to faces and danger. The just world hypothesis is, in its own way, an attempt to make sense of negative events that negativity bias has already made disproportionately painful to witness. Nearly every shortcut examined across this 100-item list traces back, eventually, to the same old asymmetry. A mind built far more carefully to notice what could hurt it than to notice what could simply make it happy. The good things rarely vanish from memory because they were unimportant. They vanish because the mind, quietly and ancient as it is, was never built to hold on to them as tightly as it holds on to the bad. 100 tricks is not the whole list. The mind has more where these came from, and researchers keep finding new variations on old familiar themes, small refinements on the same handful of shortcuts. But 100 is enough to notice the pattern behind the patterns. Nearly every trick covered here began as something useful. The bias toward a familiar face kept ancient humans close to people who had already proven safe. The urge to finish an unfinished task kept half-done work from being abandoned to weather or predators. The tendency to trust a crowd kept a small band moving in one direction instead of scattering apart and starving alone. What made these tricks into trouble was not that they went wrong exactly. It was that the world changed size far faster than the mind that has to live inside it. A shortcut built for a village of 100 familiar faces now has to make sense of a feed carrying millions of strangers. A shortcut built for real scarcity now has to make sense of a supermarket aisle stretching farther than any ancestor ever walked in a day. None of that means the mind is broken. It means it is old, in the way a good and well-worn tool can be old and still worth understanding the shape of. Tomorrow you will fall for some of these again, probably several of them, probably without noticing, the same way you likely did an hour before this video began. That is not a failure of attention. It is simply what a mind does and has always done. What changes, slowly and only with practice, is the gap between the trick landing and the moment its shape gets recognized, a half-second of doubt appearing where there used to be none at all, a quiet, familiar feeling of, oh, this again, arriving a little sooner each time it happens. That half-second is the entire prize on offer here, and it turns out to be enough. Thank you for spending this time with your own mind, tricks and all. Go gently from here. It has been doing its best, all along, with exactly what it was given.